Hey everybody, welcome to lesson 6 of my jewelry design course for Blender 4.2. In this lesson, we're going to cover the functions and features of Blender that we need to know to use during each lesson of this course. Things like rotating, sizing, applying the scale, modifiers that we need to know about, and other things that we'll cover. This is going to be a rather long video. I apologize for that, but there's a lot of things to cover and a lot of things that I'd like you to know before we get started into the designing phase of the course. Let's get started. Let's start working on lesson 6. Now, I want to remind you, this course is really not meant to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to do everything in Blender. These are the functions that we use majority of the time when designing jewelry in Blender, or at least what I use. There are, like I said before, thousands of ways to skin a cat. And you may have a different way, a better way that works for you. These are the ways that work for me, and I can perform them in the quickest possible manner. So let's start with adding objects. Now, if you've been following along so far, you open up Blender for the first time, you should look something like this on your viewport. It may be smaller, maybe bigger, depending on your screen resolution and screen size. So let's just keep that in mind. If I have this object here, and it's the de facto cube that comes with Blender's startup file, we can get rid of that and delete it by pressing X and then deleting it. And if I want to add in a new object, let's say I want to add in a cylinder, I can press Shift A and then come down to Add Mesh, and then I'll come over to the side here and select Cylinder. When the cylinder appears, we have a brief moment before we click on anything else. We have this Add Cylinder set up here, and if we click on that to open it up, you can see we have a number of vertices that are along the perimeter of the cylinder. We have a radius that we can change. For instance, if I zoom in on the cylinder, you can see each of these lines is considered connected to a vertice. For now, just keep that in mind. And if I increase this number, you can see I'm making those smaller, and by doing that, by increasing the number of vertices, I'm also increasing the definition and making that a higher resolution model. It's also increasing the memory load of your computer, so keep that in mind. Now, this object is, as we can see here, 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters, and I can adjust the radius or the depth along this issue here. So I can increase this, or I can type in, let's say I want that 4. So now it's 4 millimeters in radius or 8 millimeters in diameter. It's still 2 millimeters deep along the z-axis. Remember, the z-axis is the up and down axis. And let's say I want to make that 4. Now I've basically gone and made this 8 by 8 by 4, but I can change the depth to make this 8, just like so. Okay, so that's one way to adjust the cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and we're going to go ahead and start over with adding a new cylinder. So again, I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to come over to Mesh, and I'm going to add in a new cylinder here, just like we did before. You can see we still have these properties here, and if I want to change the vertices, I can do that just like so. Now I'm going to click off of this, and when I click off, you'll see that the window goes away. So our properties window for the new model or the new object that we entered into our viewport is gone. That's going to happen with every object you add to your viewport. So anytime you add an object, you have an opportunity before you click anywhere else to go ahead and change its properties there. Now let's say I did that by accident and I still want to change the properties. Well, I can come over here and I can see I've got my X, Y, and Z properties or my dimensions here, and if I just click one of them, and I'm going to change this to 4. Now you can see it's 4 millimeters along the x-axis because that's the one I changed. We'll select the y-axis, which is the yellow axis. I'm going to change that to 4 also. And you can see now we've got 4 by 4 by 2. So if I look at this from the front view, you can see here's 1 millimeter. Here's another millimeter. So we're 2 millimeters tall. And then we've got one area here, which is a millimeter. 2, 3, and 4. So we're 4 millimeters in diameter. We're 4 millimeters in diameter, yes. So that's what you can do there. In addition to that, I can scale it with the S key. So if I wanted to scale an object, I can click on it, and I can press S and move my mouse closer. You'll see that when I press S, It draws a line between my mouse pointer and the center of the object. Do that again so you can see it. Press S, and you can see there's a line there and the two arrows. And if I move my mouse farther away from the center, the object gets bigger. And as I move closer, the object gets smaller. And you can right-click to cancel or left-click to apply those changes. Now, here's one thing I want you to keep in mind when you're rotating or sizing an object like that. If I put my cursor over here and I press the S key, I have finer control. I have really good control, and you can see the dimensions here that are changing as I move my mouse in and out towards or away from the center point of the object. If I move my mouse much closer to the center of the object and I press S, now I have a much quicker way to size. However, you lose the ability to get finer detail if you're going to size it this way. So keep that in mind. I like to tell everybody when you're working with something, click on the object, move your mouse, substantially away from it, and then press S and then size it as appropriate as you need. Now, that's just part of scaling an object. And we've seen how to add objects. Let's go back and we're going to add in another object. We'll come back to scaling in a moment. So when I press Shift A, the menu comes up approximately where my mouse is, and I can add objects here. So in this case, we can add in a mesh object, and I have all of these meshes to choose from. I can add in a curve object, and we have all of these to choose from. I can add in a surface curve, which we don't really use for the most part in the jewelry course, but you can add in all of these other things. So if you did want to expand on it, you could. I do add a lot of text to my models for two reasons, which we'll cover later on in this course. We have volumes mostly for physics. We won't use those. Grease pencil, we won't use those. Armatures are more for 3D characters. Lattice work, we'll cover a little bit about that in a much later episode of this course. Empty objects, there are occasions where you'll want to add an empty object, and I'll be honest with you, that most of the time if I do use an empty object, it's always a plain axis. Images, you can add images as backgrounds or whatever, but we won't do that here. Lights, we sometime will add if we're rendering an object and we want to get a very realistic view of it. I will cover that in a detailed lesson for setting up your rendering. Cameras, it comes with a camera already active in your viewport, so we don't really need to worry about that. Speakers, we're not doing anything with audio files. Force field, these are for physics operations. We won't be doing any of that. And collection instances, we're not going to use that either. So just keep in mind, Shift A allows you to add in objects of any of these types. These are the multiple types of objects you can add. A curve object, for instance, if I select curve and come down to circle, you can't see it because it's hidden behind my cylinder. So we can come over here, radius, and I can increase that until it gets bigger, just like so, and then click off of that, and I can click this object again by left-clicking on it, and I have all these properties here that I can adjust, just like so. Now curves, again, we're going to be talking more specifically about those in another lesson, but at least you know how to add them and play with them. Okay, let's go back to scaling. Now I'm going to get rid of this circle that we added because we don't need it. So I'm going to press the X key and then delete. You can also, I'll just cancel that. Remember, cancel is your friend, Control Z or Command Z on a Mac. If we select that circle here, we can get rid of it with the X key. We can come over here to our outliner, select it, right click on it, and then delete it there, just like so. Or we can just select the object and press the delete key on our keyboard, and it'll go away just like that. So multiple ways to delete objects. But let's go back to sizing. Now you saw me size an object and it does it proportionately. So for instance, I'm sizing the entire object up and down as I go back and forth with my mouse. What if I only want to size it along the Z-axis? So for instance, I want to make this object taller along the blue line or the Z-axis. I can press S and then press Z, and then I can only size this along the Z-axis. Again, I can do this with the X-axis also. So if I press S and then X, now I can size it along the X-axis. You can do the same with Y. Those are the multiple ways to size objects in Blender. Now let's talk about rotation. You'll need, on occasion, to rotate objects in different directions and in different perspectives. So if we just go ahead and rotate an object, so I'm looking at the object this way, and if I just press the R key to perform a rotation, and I rotate, it's going to rotate along the current perspective view that I'm looking at the object in. And you can see it's kind of free-forming. It doesn't go in any particular way. It's kind of just stuck in la-la land, rotating around my particular angle. And I can really mess it up and get it all messed up here, just like so. And now if I want to try to get this back to its original rotation, I have an issue. So now the way to cancel that is either the Command Z to cancel your previous changes that you made in rotation, but that only works if you rotated it and then rotated again. If you performed any other functions or added any other objects and you want to unrotate this object, there's a much quicker way to do it. Select your object and press Alt-R. And you can see its rotation goes back to its original perspective. So if I look at this from the front, you can see how it looks from the front view or from the top view. That way you can always go back and perform that function. There are times, and I'll explain them later in a different course or a different lesson, where once you apply the rotation and or scale, you can never go back. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we've talked about rotating and scaling, and we've talked about adding objects. Let's cross moving objects around. So when I move objects around in my scene, I do it several ways. There are certain times you're going to do certain things when moving objects from one position to another. That performs in, the moving in 3D space. I like to work along the axes. So for me, I will grab this blue arrow, left click on it, and I can move the object up and down along the Z axis. Now, if I want to cancel that, I'll just hit Command Z and we go back. I can do the same by grabbing the red arrow and moving it along the X axis. And we can do the same with the Y axis. Now, you can also freeform move. Now, freeform move, if I'm looking at this at an angle and I press G and I just move it over here, you can see from here's our center point, our model is way off from the front view. If we go to the side view, it's still a little bit off. In the top view, it's off here too. Now, that could be what you want. However, if it's not what you want and you want to cancel that move, press Alt and G. So G is your move key. Now, you can move it with the arrows in your mouse, or you can move it with the G key, either way. And if you want to move this up and down only, then you would press G and then press X. And now I can only move it along the X axis. If I wanted to move it along the Z axis, up and down, I'd press G and then Z. And now I can only move it up and down. Or again, G and Y, and I can only move it left and right along the Y axis. So that's pretty much moving. Now, if I move it somewhere way over here again, Alt-G will bring it back to the center point or the 3D cursor. So keep that in mind. And I encourage you to play and go practice these. Okay, so we're going to get rid of this cylinder. And we're going to go back to a cube. So I'm going to hit Shift-A. I'm going to come over here and add in a cube. We're just going to look at this cube from a particular angle. While we're in object mode, there are certain functions I can do. I can move this, I can scale the object along any of the axes, I can rotate it, I can delete it, I can add it again. If we go into edit mode, and we're going to spend a lot of time in edit mode while we're designing jewelry, I press the tab key, and now you can see I have these orange dots on every single corner. Those are called vertices. Now those vertices is because we're in vertice mode here. There are 3 icons right here that will be next to your mode button. Again, it's delineated by the edit mode that we're in. And if I want to switch to edge mode, which would be the lines in between those dots, I could select it here. Now, in addition to selecting the vertice mode with your mouse here and the edges mode or the faces mode with your mouse, you can also press 1, 2, or 3 to select those modes in edit mode. And those keys are the ones on your keyboard, not your keypad, not the numeric keypad. These are the keyboard keys 1, 2, and 3. For instance, if I press 1, you can see I'm showing the little dots, right? There's the little dots. And by pressing 1, we go from within edit mode, we go into vertices selection. If I press 2 on my keyboard, now you can see I can select lines, okay? And we can select multiple lines by hitting Shift. You can see that. I can also select a whole ring of lines by pressing Alt and then the lines, and you can see it'll sometimes select them all, or Alt Shift and get a whole list. Now sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the model you're working with. In this case with the cube, it doesn't work very well, so we have to do Shift Select. So I'll grab an edge, I'll hit Shift and select while holding Shift down the other edges I want to deal with. This allows you to make changes in edit mode. For instance, if I wanted to apply a bevel to this, I can press Control B and apply a bevel. We'll cover that in another lesson, but I just want to show you what you can do. I'm going to right click to cancel that. Now if I press 3 on my keypad or my keyboard, you can see here we've changed to face mode, and you can put your mouse over that and get a little example of it, and it'll say face at the end on the right. It tells you which mode you're in. And if I click on my cube in edit mode, now you can see I'm selecting the entire face. A face is a flat surface that is connected to 3 or more vertices or edges that allows you to create basically a solid surface. If I want to grab this face, I can kind of grab it, move it, because I'm only dealing with this face. So I'm grabbing that green arrow and I'm moving this along the Y-axis, or I can grab the Z X or the X-axis and move it along X, or again I can do the Z. I'm going to cancel those. So the same can be said with the selection. In addition to that, I can also grab this and I can rotate in edit mode. So I can rotate my model and make something completely weird that may not work, and you're going to get errors in your model, but you can do some pretty strange things. Now here you can see I free rotated it, so if I press Alt R, it doesn't go back because we're in edit mode, but if I press Control or Command R, I go back to my original cube. So that's how we can work with vertices, edges, and faces in edit mode. So those will be important to learn and important to know as we work through each lesson of these courses. That will be important to know as you progress with every lesson in this course. Now, switching between edit mode and object mode. If I grab the cube here, you can see currently I'm in object mode. If I want to edit the properties of this cube, I can move my mouse over here to the drop-down list and select edit mode, and now I'll be in edit mode, and I'll be working with these selections, the vertices, edges, and faces of my choice. So I'm going to grab a face here, and you can see I'm in edit mode. There's a quicker way to switch between edit and object mode, and that's the tab key on your keyboard. If you press the tab key, you can see we're switching between object mode and edit mode. Keep in mind your mouse has to be within the 3D viewport. It can't be over here. I can't tab here. I can't move my mouse here and tab and switch. Your mouse has to be in this viewport, and the object that you want to work with has to be selected. It could be more than one object. So if I hit tab with just one object, you can see I can edit any part of that whole object. I'm going to go back into object mode, and I'm going to duplicate this, Shift D to duplicate. And now I'm going to move this over here, and I'll move this over here. So you can see we have two objects distinctly different from each other, but similar. Now if I select this object and I press tab to go into edit mode, I can edit this object here, but I can't edit any other object. Go back to object mode. I can now left click on this object, the first cube, go into edit mode by pressing tab, and now I can edit any part of this object. Here's something you probably didn't know, but if I select both by shift selecting both objects, I can press tab, and now I can edit both objects relative to each other but independently. I'm going to go back into object mode. We'll get rid of this cube by selecting it, and then I'll just delete it. Okay, so that object's gone. Now let's move on to what I'll call Boolean functions. And Boolean functions, if you're not familiar with them, might take you a little time to get used to. Now, I'm just going to go over this quickly because we'll be going over the Boolean functions in a great amount of detail as we progress in many of the lessons of this course. So let's go ahead and grab this cube again. And now I'm going to duplicate it by pressing Shift-D and pressing Enter. And now I have a second cube denoted in your outliner by cube 001. And I'm going to move that over a little bit, kind of drag it to the back and up. So now my cubes are similar to the way they were before. And now I want to talk to you about Boolean these objects. A Boolean function is where you join or subtract the geometry of one object from or to another. You can also get the difference of the objects. I don't work with differences very much in jury design. However, there are times where you'll need to know it, and as we progress through the courses, I will cover this as we need to. But for the most part, Boolean joining and Boolean subtracting are what we're going to work with the most. Let's start with Boolean joining. There are several ways we can apply a Boolean to multiple objects, and you do need to have multiple objects selected. We can come over to the Boolean tab because we activated that in our preferences, if you remember. And if you have followed along, you should have that tab there. If you don't, please go back and watch the setup video for Blender. Now that we've got these selected, we have two categories of Boolean functions. The first is called destructive. The second is called non-destructive. So let me show you what each of those are. We're going to do a Boolean difference or a Boolean subtraction. And how you select your objects is important. For instance, either one of these objects could be the one I want to work with. For instance, let's say this is the object that I want to continue working with after I cut this section of the intersecting geometry out of the first cube. Okay, it might sound complicated, but first thing we're going to do is we're going to select the box that we want to use as what I call a cutter. We're going to use this as a cut piece to cut this area out of the first cube here. Now I'm going to select the cutter. This is the object I want to cut out. I'm going to hold the Shift key down and select my good final object. And I'm going to come over to Boolean difference. And what you can see now is the second cube that we added has been cut away from the first cube, leaving us with this little gap. Leaving us with this little gap or cutout within our first cube. Now that's fine and dandy if that's what you want, but don't get ahead of yourself. I'm going to show you some more. I'm going to press Command Z and we're going to go back. I'm going to take this cube and I'm going to move it to the back just a little bit more. I'm going to hit Shift D and then press Enter. And I'm going to grab the arrow and I'm going to move this cube forward just a little bit, leaving us a gap in between this cube here and this cube here, but making sure that both cubes kind of blend into our first cube. And again, this first cube is the one we want. So to do a destructive Boolean, I'm going to click and hold this one. I'm going to hold the Shift key down and I'm going to select the new cube that we just made. And now you can see that cube is highlighted in an orangey yellow, where this is an orangey red highlight. What that means is with the standard setup for your themes, this lighter yellow orange color border is your active object. It's the object that's going to be left over after you apply whatever you apply to it, a Boolean difference, a Boolean union, an intersect. However, what I'm showing you is I'm taking this first one as a cutter, shift selecting the second one. While holding the Shift key down, I'm going to select the original cube. And now you can see that the cube here and the last cube we added are both kind of a reddish bordered object, leaving us with our active object in the yellow-orange. And now I can come over to Boolean difference, and I've selected two objects to cut simultaneously into our final object, which is left like this. These are important things to remember. Again, you're going to learn more as we go along with Boolean differences. I'm going to Command Z these. We're going to get rid of this cube here. We don't need it, so let's get rid of it. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Boolean union. Now, let's say I have this object here. Well, we're going to get rid of this. I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to hit Shift A, and we're going to add in a UV sphere. And I'm going to bring that up on the Z-axis, just about like this. Now, when we did the Boolean difference, I can select that, select the second object, and do a difference. And you can see now I've cut a hole in our model. But we're going to go ahead and do a union. A union is basically going to join our models. We can add or join models in a variety of different ways. There are two specific ways. One is using the Booleans. The second is using Control-J or join. I'm going to show you the difference between Control-J to join and then the union feature for Booleans so that you can see how your model is affected. For instance, if I want to take these two models and join them together, I could do a Boolean union, or I can do Control-J to join those objects. However, these objects are now considered to be one, but they are two separate objects, and these two separate objects can be denoted by the model itself. So if I go into Edit mode and I go into Tab, it looks like they're all one object. These little globes here, these four little globes, if we come over to this square next to them, that's called invisibility, and you can see our globe is actually inside our cube, and the geometry is all part of that. So I could select any one of these, and I could drag it around and bring it out, and it's sticking out of my model just like that. And if I go back here, you can see I've got this weird thing going on with this particular model. That will not work well for 3D printing. Just keep that in mind. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that out. So that's what Control-J does. So again, if I grab this, grab the cube, and do Control-J, I've joined these objects. I can edit them basically simultaneously like we did when we had multiple selections. They are still considered two objects. The only way to tell them is to basically look in invisibility mode. And you can see that our globe here is well inside of our cube. Now, again, we don't want that for most of the modeling we do. Let's go back. So I'm going to cancel that whole process. We're going to turn off invisible mode. And I'm going to take this object here. I'm going to shift select the object that I want as my selected object. And I'm going to go to Boolean union. Okay, so now I've just basically joined those models together, but in a permanent way. How I can tell this is by going into invisibility mode now, and you can see our models is basically one, and that the geometry has changed within our square or cube to match the geometry of the surface point contact of the globe. If I go into edit mode, you can see here we've got connecting lines going all the way around, and we've basically joined these two pieces together. So if I go into vertice mode, I click on the vertices here, and I grab this one and just kind of move it around, you can see how they're kind of connected. Again, you could have errors in your model, so be careful when you do this. Just something to consider. And we're going to cover, again, more uses of Boolean as we move along. Okay, let's go back to object mode. We've got our globe here, or our UV sphere, and our cube is still there. Now let's say I want to take the difference of these two. So I've got this object here, the globe, contacting the cube. But let's say I want the cube to be, or the section of the cube I want is where the two of them actually have mass together or meet. I can select the globe, shift select the cube, and come to intersect. And what that leaves me with, if you kind of saw that, is this half cut bowl of the difference between those two, or the contacting points of those two, I'm sorry. In addition, you've got some other functions here. We're not going to cover those, so don't worry about those. They'll pop up once in a while. Okay, so now that's done, but we're going to go back, so I'm pressing Control-Z to go back. I'm going to take this and make this a little smaller, just so that our our UV sphere is a little bit smaller than our cube. And now I'm going to show you the non-destructive performance factors. This involves a section of Blender called modifiers. And if I come over to the modifiers tab, every time I add a non-destructive Boolean, it's going to add in a modifier to perform that function. Now, non-destructive means that I can get rid of this cutter at any time because this UV sphere is my cutter. The cube is going to be the object that I'm working with. So if I click on the UV sphere and shift select the cube, I can come over to non-destructive difference. And what you'll see is Blender will build this little box around the cylinder or the UV sphere itself. I can move that around. Well, let's grab the cylinder, and if I move that, you can see it's basically allowing me to move my cutter anywhere around this object that I want. I can either do it freehand or I can use the arrow keys to move it in and out, up and down, left and right, however you want to do it, or I could freeform it with the G key. Now remember I said it adds in a modifier. So if we grab our cube, you can see a difference combined modifier has been added. And here are the properties for our non-destructive difference. Now, if I want to get this to be in a certain space, I'm just going to click on this globe. I'm going to move it over just a little bit. Let's say I want it here. I can go ahead and keep modeling this whole cube. For instance, I can come down here. I can go into edit mode. I can select this. I'm going to go into edge mode and select this edge. And if I move that down, you can see in edit mode, it doesn't apply the feature of the cutout. But if I go back and press tab, now you can see I'm making changes to our particular model using the sphere as our cutter. Our cutter is staying stationary while I'm modifying the proportions of our cube. So that's what's non-destructive. I'm going to go back and we'll cancel that out. Okay, so now what if I want to do a union? Okay, so I can do the same thing with a union. I'm going to select my cutter, and in this case it's not going to be a cutter, it's going to be an object we're adding to the cube by shift selecting the cube. So again, the object we're using as our additive or cutter is red, and orange or yellow is our selection. I'm going to come over to union, non-destructive union. Now that's pretty cool. I can actually select this union piece, this globe here, and move it anywhere I want. Okay, and it's going to come over there, and now it's going to basically make the model look like this sphere is added to the cube. And again, if I select the cube, because we're applying the modifier to the cube, not the sphere, here's the functions of that combined non-destructive union. Now, what happens if this is where I want it to be and I've used the non-destructive? How do I make it permanent? Very easy. You'll just come over here to this little check mark and you can say apply the modifier. If I click that little check mark, boom, it's applied. I can actually get rid of this square here, and I can get rid of this wireframe model, and there's our union. And if I grab that, you can see I'm grabbing the whole thing. If we go into edit mode, it's perfectly cut and added to this cube. And if I look, there's no extra geometry like we had with the Control J. So those are basically the Boolean functions that we'll be using. And I use a variety of difference in union destructive and difference in union non-destructive. I'm going to be honest with you, because I've been modeling so long, I know when to apply those and when not. So just follow along in the lessons during this course and you'll learn those steps too. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about global and local orientation. Global and local orientation are not that hard to understand. For instance, I've got the cube here, our default cube that we add to Blender. It's lined up with its faces perpendicular to each axis it's pointing to. So for instance, I can move this along the X, Y, and Z axis anytime I want. And I can do this with the arrow keys. However, if I rotate this, and I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to play R, and I'm going to free rotate this just like so, you can see that our axes are still pointing in the up and down, left and right directions. So they're still along the X and Y, Z axis as our arrows. But what happens if I've rotated an object like that and I want to make some changes to it? I want it to get longer along the face of this particular model. If I hit S and then Z, you can see it's not going to do it. So what I'm going to do is come over to local, and we come over to where our orientation is. This is called transform orientations. And we're going to go from global to local. And now you can see that the lines are facing the correct directions according to the faces they are perpendicular to, which means I can come now over here in edit mode. I can press 3 on my keyboard and select this particular face. And now I can move it up and down, but along its orientation. If I come back to global orientation and I try to move this along Z, and I'm just going to grab this and move it, you can see it's not moving straight or perpendicular to the axis that I want it to go to. So that's something to consider, and that's something I'd like you to play with. In addition to that, we're going to come over here to global. We want to sometimes apply the scale and rotation of a model. So you'll hear me say a lot of times, apply the rotation and scale. I'm going to say that a lot during each lesson for this course. To do so, we press Control, and we're going to go into object mode first. So let's go into object mode. And again, you can do that with the tab key, or you can do it by selecting the drop-down list here. And I've rotated this object, and now I want it, it's permanently where I want it. So I'm going to apply the transform of the rotation and the scale. By doing that, I'm going to press Control A, and a new menu will pop up. When that pops up, you're just going to come down to rotation and scale, and that's what I mean when I say apply the scale, apply the rotation, or apply both. You're going to click that here. And even if I go into local mode now, you can see it does not change because we've applied the rotation of our object to be permanently in that particular space. Doesn't mean we can't make changes to it. It just means its orientation is now set. So that's the difference between local and global orientations. And again, we'll be covering those in lessons in the future. Now, let's say that we've got a variety of objects on our screen. So I'm going to add in some more meshes. We'll add in a UV sphere. We're going to add in a cone. We're going to add in a torus. And we'll add in, what else can we add in? How about an icosphere? Okay, so I'm just going to move these around. And let's say I'm working with a particular model, or let's say that this model is built into this, and I need to make some changes to it, and I can't work with it because the cube is blocking it. So I want to make changes to the cone, but I can't make changes to the cone. Even if I go into edit mode, I can't see anything. So what I can do is I can select my cube and press the H key and hide the cube. Now I can come over here, make any changes I want. So we're going to select this point here, and I'm just going to move it over there like that. I'm going to press the tab key to go back into object mode, and now I want to unhide the cube that I hid before. I'm going to press Alt H, and our cube comes back. Now, let's say that I still want to work on this cone, but I want to hide multiple objects. I can just select them and press H, and if I hit Alt H, Alt H, my models come back. I can also do something else. I want to make some changes to the cone because I'm not happy with the way the cone looks. All of this stuff is in my way, and all I really want to focus on is this cone. To do that, the slash key on your keyboard, just press that, and that's the isolation key. So if I click that, it isolates and zooms into the object that you're isolating with the slash key. Once you've made all the changes that you want to that cone or that object, press the slash key again, and all the objects will come back. So that covers isolation and hide, and those are things I want you to learn because we'll be using those quite a bit during this course. Now in the setup file, we did cover a little bit about orientation, but again, I want you to become familiar with orientations. The keys that we'll be using the most are as follows. On your keypad, you will be using the 1, 3, and 7 keys. In addition to the 1, 3, and 7, you'll be pressing combinations of 1, 9, 3, 9, 3, 7, 7, 9. just to get different orientations quickly. So if I want to look at this from the front view, I press 1 on my keypad. Again, this is the keypad, not the keyboard. So with my cursor here, I'll press there, and now I'm looking straight on from the front view. If I want to look at it from the side view, I'll press 3. And if I go back to front view and I say I want to look at this from the side, I press 3. Oh, but that's the wrong side. I want to look at the opposite side. I can just go ahead and press 9, and it rotates that 180 degrees. If I want to look at this from the top view, I will press 7 on my keypad, and now I'm looking straight down at these models from the top. Okay, so that's how we work with orientation. Again, you can also do it with these little items here. If I want to look at the top down, I'd press Z. And if I want to look at the, let's see, the bottom, I can press negative Z. Okay, and again, we can do that with negative X and X or Y, however you want to go back and forth and switch back and forth. So quickly, if I press Y to look at it from the side view, and I want to see the opposite side, I can click Y again in the middle, and that switches to the opposite side. It's as if I press 3 and then 9. So if you're used to working with your mouse and you'd rather have this little orientation or viewport orientation control here, just make sure it's turned on in your overlays. And I believe we got it here, annotation 3D text stats, and nope, I'm sorry, it's the gizmos. We want to keep that on. Again, we've set this up before, so there's no reason to go and change it. If you do go and change it, we just have to go back and reset it all up. So that's it for the object orientation or the viewport orientation. Now we're going to talk about remeshing objects. Remeshing is a modifier in Blender, and I use this quite a bit. How I use it is I'll select an object, just like this, and I'm going to press Control A, and I'm going to apply the rotation and scale. That makes this object physically accurate to Blender. So applying the rotation and scale applies its rotation as a permanent fixture and its scale as a permanent fixture. Again, we can go change these and reapply, and you can see the information here. For instance, if I grab this icosphere and I scale it up just a little bit, you can see here along the scale, we've scaled it approximately 48%. If I apply that by pressing Control A and apply the rotation and scale, take quick note at the scale settings, and boom, they are all reset to 1. You'll want to do that with some models because you'll need to have that applied to perform the modifier remesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our icosphere. I'm going to come over here to add modifier, and we can come down to the remesh modifier here. If I click on that, you'll notice that the icosphere will change somewhat within the 3D viewport. And you can see it got a little bit smoother. Now, for all practical purposes, the remesh modifier has several functions. It has a voxel, a sharp, a smooth, and blocks. So let's take a look at, if we look at the sort of blocky way, you can see it looks like it's all just cubes stuck together. If I press the smooth key, it gives us this smooth type of object. It's not perfect. You can see we've got a couple little nudges here. The sharpen will sharpen off or physically like flatten the surfaces of certain faces on the model. And then voxel, which we'll use the most, is a way to generate some geometry and give you a little bit of a softer feel to it, much like the smooth option. Now, with voxel size here in our modifier and that object selected, I can come over here and change this. And a lot of times in the jury size, my scaling is once my scaling is set for my jury objects, because they tend to be small, we will tend to shrink this down, and I'll make this 0.05, and you can see the faces kind of blend together a little bit more. You can actually increase this and see it for yourself firsthand how it works by clicking in this box, holding your left mouse button, and sliding it left and right. Okay, so maybe that's what I want. And I can apply it here or pin it to the top. Pinning is not something we're going to worry about just yet, but we'll cover that in the future. Once I apply this, it'll make this permanent. But if I want to see the changes made before I apply this, I can come over here to these 4 little globes and come over here to wireframe shading. If I select that, you can see the geometry that it has added. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to drop this down and make this smaller. You can see I'm getting much more geometry within my mesh. If I make this number larger, you see I get less geometry within my mesh, to the point where I can almost make a cube or a triangle out of it, just like so. Okay, now I've got it the way I want it. I'm going to turn off the wireframe by coming over here to viewport mode, and I'm going to select viewport shading solid. And then if I go into edit mode now, you can see our icosphere has still got these big sides. But looking at it in reality, it's got multiple sides, but that's because modifiers change an object without making them permanent. So what I want to do is make this permanent by clicking on the check mark. Now if I go into edit mode, you can see it's broken up into many faces, vertices, and edges. Okay, with that done, let's go back into object mode. Let's just get rid of this. Now I'm going to take this icosphere and, well, let's get rid of all these other things here. So I'm going to shift select them, press X, delete. Take this object here and press Alt G to move it back into the middle, just because I like working in the middle. Now what I want to do is solidify this model. Now a solidify modifier is another modifier we can add to an existing mesh or a curve. It can be applied to both. And again, we're going to cover curves in a different video, but for the most part, the solidify modifier is one that you'll be adding because I use it all the time. So if I come over here to solidify, you can see it applies the modifier. Well, it doesn't apply it. It adds the modifier to the model. And now these functions here are controlling the output of our model. If I go into wireframe mode, you can see that a little bit better. Now I can come over here and I can change certain values, how thick I want it to be. And in this case, by making it solid, I'm actually creating also a hole in the model. I can change its inner and outer settings here. Sometimes that'll have an effect, sometimes it won't. So keep that in mind. I can flip normals, things like that. We will be covering the solidify modifier in an upcoming lesson in much more detail. Let's go back to solid view. And again, I'm going to get rid of this modifier by deleting it here. So it's gone. There's no modifier as that. If I go into edit mode, you can see this is the object that we've got edited. Again, if I scale this up and then rotate it, I'm going to press RX90 and rotate that along the X 90 degrees. And I'm going to apply, using Control A, the rotation. And then I can press Control A and apply the scale. Or, because you usually apply those both together, Control A, rotation, and scale. Boom, done. We'll be using that in much more realistic modeling as we move on, but I do want you to know about that right now. Okay, let's get rid of this particular model, and let's go ahead and add in a cube. So here's our standard cube. Now, a lot of times I'll be adding loops or loop cuts to a model. To do this, we do this in edit mode. So I'm going to go press tab, go into edit mode. I'm going to make sure that I've got edges selected, although it doesn't really matter for the edge loops or the loop cuts. And I'm going to press Control R to add in a loop cut while this object is selected. Press Control R and you can see it adds in a loop right there. Now I can do nothing to that. It puts it in the middle of wherever I move my mouse. So if I want it vertically, I can move it to the bottom. If I want it horizontally, I can move it to the side. So here's a couple functions that you have to think about when using loop cuts. I am going to right now just move my cursor to the side and I'm going to left click. Okay. Now it's not permanent because now you can see the two arrows. I can move this up and down and I can move this cut wherever I want it to be, but only along the path of those arrows. So let's say I want to put it here. Once I get it to the location I want it to be permanent, I'll left click. If I don't like that, I can right click and it goes right to the center. However, when it does that, I have no more control over moving this up and down. So keep that in mind. I'm going to press Control Z and go back. Again, we'll do Control R to add in a loop cut. And now I'm going to select my loop cut, press that once, and now my left arrow or my left mouse button has got us here with one click. I can move it up and down. And let's say I want to put it right there. I'm just going to left click one more time. And now that loop cut is in our model and it's up here at the top. What if I want more loop cuts? Again, we can press Control R and add in multiple loop cuts. And let's say I want 10 of them. I can use my scroll wheel and add in loop cuts, or I can take them away before I press the left mouse button. This allows me to change the number of loop cuts that I have in there, and you can go infinite. But for our purposes, we're going to do this right here. Again, press the left mouse button. It makes it semi-permanent, but I can move it up and down. And if I want to make this permanent, I'll just right-click. Boom, it's done. Now I've got multiple cuts through my model. There's another way to do this. Again, we're going to go into edit mode or stay in edit mode. I'm going to press Control R. And I'm going to put that there. And now I'm going to type in, let's say I want 50 loop cuts. I can type in 50 on my keyboard or keypad and then press Enter. And it puts those cuts wherever the cursor is. And now I can move the cursor up and down, hit the left mouse button, and it's applied. So I want you to play with these functions and features. It's going to take some time to get used to before the next lesson, but knowing these is going to make life easier because you'll be able to follow me knowing what these functions do as we progress through each lesson in the course. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Again, it's not meant to be an overall modeling tutorial on Blender, but these are the functions that we will use during the model making of jewelry in this course. Thanks and have a great day.